Welcome to the second part of the Joan lecture on Bill's birthday today. But nevertheless, he's happy to give us a lecture on the failure of economics, reality and language. For those who don't know Bill yet, Bill is a professor of economics at the University of Newcastle, Australia, and has become very famous for his job parenting plans. His, also, I would say, his non-orthodox view on economics, and I think we will have a taste of that in lecture. So, Bill, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much. So the latest fad that we've been dealing with is fake news. You know, that's all awash in the media now, and everyone's talking about fake news and all of the rest of it. But you know, it's nothing new in macroeconomics, the idea of fake knowledge, and that what I'm going to talk about today is that really the standard macroeconomic programs in our universities all around the world, and I'm very familiar with programs in Britain, in continental Europe, in US, in Canada, in Australia and New Zealand, so that's just about most. And I've just finished writing a textbook which Macmillan will be publishing soon on macroeconomics, so I've thought a lot about curriculum and pedagogy and those sort of things. And what I'm going to say today is that the mainstream macroeconomics teaching programs and the research that flows from those qualifications is basically peddling fake knowledge. And it's been doing that for decades. And what the average graduate of a 3-year or 4-year sequence then going on to a graduate school derives from all of that teaching is virtually zero knowledge. So that's the proposition. Here's a quote, and there's a few quotes, and I normally never have very busy slides because I know they're not very good, but I think that a couple of quotes are very good for this purpose. This is Paul Sweezy, who was a US economist, long dead, very famous Marxist economist, and he was a very antagonistic to neoclassical economics. So, you know, he said that, and we'll just paraphrase this, that typical economics program is it embodies this free market 19th century classical thinking. And by that he really meant marginal thinking, not the classical thinking. It was an exercise in diminishing returns, and it was a very pointed terminology given the concept of diminishing returns in our microeconomic thinking. And he said it basically concerned itself with smaller and decreasingly insignificant questions, and to compensate for the trivialisation of the content, it surrounded itself, enveloped itself in increasingly sophisticated technical expositions and tools and approaches. The contention is that not much has really changed since 1972 when he wrote this, but it's not just the trivialisation of the content that matters. That's what I'm about to say, is that it's even more than that, it's even more insidious than that. And you think about a standard undergraduate program, you don't really learn much after first year. You learn a whole lot of tools and techniques and very sophisticated ways of not knowing much, but in substance you don't really learn much more after the first few weeks of economics. And that was Sweezy's point. When we think about the global financial crisis, the GFC up here, just reflect just before that, and if you're familiar with the literature, which most of us should be in this room, my interpretation of macro, and I'm now talking about macro, not micro. Macroeconomics, the mainstream of our profession, became very smug in the 1980s and 1990s. And we had the dominance of, you know, Eugene Farmer, Chicago, parading around with efficient market theory. It basically said, no worries, there's no financial markets will always deliver. And we had Robert Lucas making his presidential address in 2003 to the AEA, where he basically declared the business cycle is dead. And we had Ben Bernanke declaring the great moderation, all the big problems have been solved. The dominant research and teaching approach was so-called New Keynesian economics, even though they shouldn't be putting Keynes in the title. And that was so blasé about all this efficient markets and great moderation, so blasé that it didn't even have financial markets in the macro model. And as a consequence, it's no surprise that the mainstream of our profession failed, which is the majority of us, failed to even predict the GFC, but moreover failed to see it coming. Prediction's one thing as to when it's going to occur, but actually to be able to understand that it was going to happen, no problem. That's another matter. And I first started coming here, I shocked myself to remember 25 years ago. And I was pretty quiet about what I was doing in those days, and but what I was part of was developing with a very small group of non-orthodox economists what is now called modern monetary theory, which is sort of starting to spread a bit. And we were writing in the 1990s, when I'd sit up there and I was writing articles and stuff, we were writing about the way in which these imbalances in balance sheets of households and firms were going to lead to an unsustainable situation which would crash. But the rest of the profession were just blithely unaware. And it was because they were embedded in these approaches, this new Keynesian DSGE type approach, that didn't make it possible for them to understand that, what was happening in the real world. This was Lucas's statement. We shouldn't read it all, but he says that in my thesis, this is his presidential address, is that his major argument was that macroeconomics, in the original sense, as a discussion of the economic cycle and why the cycle and how you deal with it, has succeeded. In other words, we've solved the business cycle. We won't have recessions anymore. We've solved all of that. And what he was basically saying was that all the government should then be doing is further deregulation, further welfare state retrenchment, further cutting of minimum wages. In other words, it was a microeconomics reform agenda, which became the dominant policy agenda in the 1980s and the 1990s, starting with the big privatisations through to the rest of it. Now, this is again, I normally never would have that many points, but I just wanted to fit them all onto one slide. A few years ago, Olivier Blanchard wrote that economics had reached macroeconomics had reached a grand consensus, and he said it was sort of like haiku poetry. If you're familiar, this is a very strict form of Japanese poetry, haiku. And Blanchard was using the analogy of we've reached this point in macroeconomics where we all accept a sort of haiku approach to doing our business. If you think this is the way the mainstream operate, you assert without foundation, these are so-called micro-foundations, some assumptions about rationality, about maximisation, about rational expectations, which have no correspondence to the way in which people who actually, professionals who actually study what people do, psychologists, sociologists, anthropologists and the rest, that we make assumptions in this haiku approach which bear no correspondence to the way that people actually behave. And then, of course, we can't deal with people anyway because heterogeneity doesn't allow us to have tractable mathematical models. So we then invent a stylised representative agent and a representative firm. And then we assert that one person who's very powerful in their knowledge and computational skills operates within a efficient, competitive environment which is our benchmark for analysing everything. We write some very trivial mathematical equations down and we solve them. And they've got to be pretty simple because, of course, solutions are difficult to make if things get too complicated. We then introduce some policy shock, which proves that, among other things, that fiscal policy is ineffective. We might invoke Ricardian equivalence or some other nonsensical proposition that defies the way psychologists and sociologists tell us about human behaviour. And we then say, oh, but we're being quite reasonable because we might allow for sticky prices some short-term effects, stimulus effects. That's the Keynesian bit of the new. And then we get some data and we realise that the model doesn't fit the data. It's impossible to fit the data with the model. And so then we realise that the only way we're going to get any correspondence between, say, output inflation in our Phillips curve of our new Keynesian model is to introduce some ad hoc lags, because that gets us the fit. And then, of course, we never admit that once we do that, all the pretence to rigour with these micro foundations is gone. What we're dealing with then is not a micro-founded model at all, it's just an ad hoc piece of garbage. And then we maintain that pretence of rigour and micro-foundations because that's our claim to intellectual authority. That allows us to parade in a smug way and say, well, we know all this stuff. And then we publish some article that just reinforces the starting assumptions. And the knowledge quotient of all of that, absolutely zero. Garbage in, garbage out. That's the mainstream macro. Case study is the IMF, for example, uses new Keynesian DSG models. And as I said at the beginning, this is not an attack on econometric modelling or whatever. I do it myself sometimes. So it's not an attack on forecasting errors. We all make forecasting errors virtually by definition. It's an attack on systematic forecasting errors. Because the IMF systematically makes forecasting errors, and you can understand the basis of the bias in the systematic nature of the errors because it's derived from the very nonsense that they use as starting assumptions for their models. You'll always note that the IMF, when they're advocating austerity, will predict the consequences of austerity will be lower than what they end up being. Systematically, they make those errors every time. In 2010 and 2012, they were very key components of the Greek disaster. And at the time, all of their modelling said that if we have fiscal contraction, we'll have an expansion out of it because of these Ricardian effects and these other responses from the non-government sector. And of course, the modelling was disastrously wrong. And not long after that, they admitted that they'd been using spending multipliers of below unity. And then they'd done a little bit of new work and they'd found spending multipliers of 1.7. Well, you know the difference between below 1 and 1.7. Totally the opposite policy advice would be forthcoming. It was no surprise. Anybody knew anything knew that the austerity was going to kill the Greek economy. But the IMF said it wouldn't. And when they had their independent audit in 2012, the auditor said that the IMF was trapped in a destructive groupthink, a system of self-reinforcing denial, and that they used useless new Keynesian DSG models to perpetuate that denial. And when I read that, people sort of might have been surprised. I was not surprised at all. Just go back to 20 or 30 years of IMF operations in developing countries where I've done quite a bit of work. And their structural adjustment programs have been total disasters for the well-being of the most impoverished nations in the world. Why is that? Because they peddle fake knowledge. And, so when I said it's not just about the trivialisation of content, there's further issues involved in our professional integrity and our professional standards. Well, we've got to the stage where I believe the mainstream macroeconomics profession is guilty of malpractice. Because if a professional like an engineer, and I said this last night, builds a bridge and it falls down, they go to jail. They get severe penalties. Well, who went to jail over the Greek disaster? Who went to the jail when the IMF admitted that they'd got it all wrong? No one. And the mainstream macro teaching programs have barely blinked at all of this failure. And, William Bowder's no radical. He's a pretty core sort of mainstream guy. And this is what he said about New Keynesian, the standard paradigm in macroeconomics. The unfortunate uselessness of the state of art in academic monetary economics. The unfortunate uselessness, fake knowledge. And read on, he said, most mainstream macroeconomic theoretical innovations since the 1970s, blah, blah, have turned out to be self-referential, inward-looking distractions at best. That's groupthink. Research tended to be motivated by the internal logic, in other words, the GIGO approach, garbage in, garbage out. Intellectual sunk capital, in other words, we have such incentive structures in our academic hierarchies that we can never really admit that we're wrong and say abandon our previous training and start again. So we've got intellectual sunk capital that's path dependent and stops us admitting that we're wrong. So we deny that we're wrong and we cover with smoke screens. All of this has stopped us from understanding how the economy works, let alone how the economy works during times of stress. The economics profession has been caught in as unprepared. The DSGE equilibrium, DSGE approach excludes everything relevant to the pursuit of financial stability. Everything that's relevant to monetary economics, the mainstream approach to monetary economics excludes. Macmillan's about to publish my textbook, which I'm writing with two other people, and they go out and send out reviews. And the really interesting part of the review process was the mainstream reviewers were incredibly rude and just said, never should be published, it's ridiculous. And it was such the denial in their justification. How can you publish this stuff because it's not micro-founded, it doesn't use rational expectations? Never, not a statement saying, well, they haven't used rational expectations because rational expectations is important and valuable because it's this. No, it's just assumed that that's the only approach, the haiku approach. And of course, one of the reviewers said, this is a very old-fashioned approach to economics. And when the publisher asked me to comment on the review, I said, well, it's very strange that in 2008 and 2009, our governments all around the world became very old-fashioned. And the whole notion of micro-founded macro is a con. And that's because it can't say anything about the real world in its rigorous state, in its pure mathematical form based upon the starting assumptions that allow for tractable solutions to the model. It can't possibly say anything about the real world. And so once they have to say something about the real world with all the ad hoc adjustments to that micro-founded beginning, the micro-foundations are gone. And we've been misleading our students for some decades now by claiming that these rigorous models are the intellectual high ground, but we don't even, and we never have even occupied that high ground ourselves. There's another stream of this where all these guys are coming out now, like Krugman and Cristiano and Ren Lewis, and there's a whole stack of them, and they're saying, oh yeah, we've made a few mistakes, but we really knew this all along, And we've still got a fundamental mainstream model that's perfect for the use of understanding the real world. What model is that? ISLM, their New Keynesian style. That's the model that they say. For a start, the ISLM model was a bastardisation of Keynes's initial insights anyway, and so it should never have been used in the first place. How can you assert that investment is a function of the current interest rate when investment decisions are years in the making? How can you assert that the central bank controls the money supply when it can't control the money supply? So the original ISLM conception was deeply flawed and, in my view, unusable. But the new Keynesian version of the bastardised ISLM model is even worse. I'm sure I don't have to tell you some of the limitations of it. IS curves without investment in it. And these omnipresent and unbelievably computationally skilled households, at the end of the day, you still get long-run neutrality. Statements about what I would call monetary operations that have no basis in reality, and I'll come back to that point. And so I don't believe that this attempt to resurrect the credibility of New Keynesian economics has the slightest credibility at all. And this all leads to the conclusion that the real problem is that we've become trapped in what social psychologists call groupthink. And this is sort of like a mob rule. It's pattern behaviour, and it actively discourages dissent. And we've got a whole edifice, a whole structured set of processes within our economics departments that attempt to eliminate dissent. Graduate programs filter out. I remember I was told I should go and study sociology even though I was better at mathematics than most of the people in the class. And through refereeing processes, through distribution of competitive grants, the panels that determine them, through promotional structures within our universities. All these ways are ways of disciplining who gets through, who makes it. One of the offshoots of all of this control and denial is that there's solid research now showing that graduates of economics, the hardcore economics programs, develop socio-pathological tendencies. When behavioural studies have examined, compared them to other social science graduates, the economists tend to have these socio-pathological tendencies, which reinforces this sort of cool detachment that it's based upon rational maximisation, etc. And the denial is paramount. How many people in the room, there's a question there, it's a little quiz. How many people here know what the Cambridge controversy was about? Okay, I'm not attempting to embarrass anybody. The young people don't. This was, and I won't go into it, but this was a big debate in the 1960s between the two Cambridges on either side of the Atlantic. And this debate basically concluded with Paul Samuelson, for example, on the neoclassical side at admitting that, the Cambridge England was correct. And it was to do with the valuation of capital, it was to do with the responses of capital-labour ratios to relative prices. And what was the conclusion? That neoclassical distribution theory, in other words, marginal productivity theory, was wrong. It couldn't explain what it was attempting to explain. Now you go and get any economics textbook and go to the page on distribution and marginal productivity and factor prices and capital-labour ratios and elasticities of substitution and all the rest of it. You won't hear a mention of the Cambridge controversy. It's just been obliterated from the knowledge. So young people, you're being misled. Because knowledge was created that's now denied. That's the point. How come this can persist? How come that our profession can maintain its credibility and its influence in the policy debate? How come? Well, one of the research programs I've been involved in with Dr. Louisa Connors, the use of language and the way you frame ideas is really important to how you get those ideas accepted. And that's the next part of the talk. It's quite obvious to anybody who wants to really stand outside the groupthink that mainstream macroeconomics is what Lakatos would have called a degenerative paradigm. In other words, its empirical content is very low, if not zero. In other words, as a body of theory, it has no empirical correspondence. That's the idea of a degenerative paradigm. In other words, it's useless to understand anything. Lakatos, who wrote after Kuhn, of course, he was very interested in how these research programs, or as Kuhn called them, paradigms, how they maintain their dominance in the scientific community, in inverted commas, how they maintain their dominance even when they're degenerating, even when it's obvious that they're useless. How do they stay as the dominant paradigm before something new comes along? What I argue is that the way in which it's mainstream macro retains its dominance, even though it has no knowledge quotient at all, it's fake knowledge, is through this series of linked myths which are reinforced by a very clever way of using language that appeals to the way that humans cognate, learn things, and learn to understand their physical world. And this is where Dr. Connors' work's been very important to help me understand these sort of... This last point, even though they're peddling a pack of lies, they do it in a way that makes us think it's truth. Well, here's some examples of metaphors that exploit the way in which we think, and I don't read them all, but we'll just pick a couple, that are used in mainstream economics and in policy-making circles and by journalists who then repeat mainstream economics. So, for example, focus of attack, government spending. So the orthodox economics doesn't like government spending particularly. It's a free market, self-regulating type model. The second one there, nation has maxed out its credit card. That's a sort of a metaphorical claim. You're trying to get people to associate a government fiscal position with something that they've got a tangible understanding of, their credit card, and it's maxed out. We all know what happens when we max out our credit limit each month, and then we use that metaphorical association with the physical object to make a statement about something that's unrelated to that. And so we immediately know what that means. That means that the government will run out of money and that it's due to irresponsible spending, because the word maxed out has a very emotive meaning in the way we understand the language. So when you see a politician come out and say that we're maxing out our credit card, well, then the message that we get as citizens through that metaphorical claim is that the government's being irresponsible and it's about to run out of money. And it's a very strong reinforcing method of using language and framing, but it's totally wrong. Has no empirical or logical content. People say that. I'm just picking examples here. And when we think of astronomy, a black hole's a pretty scary place. We don't have any control of it. So we've got metaphorical understandings of black holes and Star Wars and all sorts of things, and we know we can't. It's beyond our control, and it's dangerous, and it's about to be a massive star's about to collapse. And we think about that, and then we relate it to the budget. And we start to form, we're reinforcing the view that any fiscal deficit is going to create a collapse of some sort. Here's some basic myths in mainstream macro. The government's like a household. So Robert Barrow wrote once that we can understand the government budget by relating it back to the household budget. government budget constraint literature that emerged in the 1960s with Carl Christ and others was an attempt to draw a direct analogy between a currency issuing government's fiscal situation and that of the household. And as households, we know we can run out of money, and that we know we have to finance our spending by drawing down savings, earning income, borrowing, or selling assets. And we therefore immediately think that the government has to do the same thing. Totally untrue, as I'll explain in a moment. Printing money is inflationary and bonds less so. So students go through these elaborate discussions of different forms of funding government spending, and I'm inverted commas funding, and that printing money, in inverted commas, is highly inflationary, whereas if you issue bonds, it's not as inflationary. It's completely wrong. And if you issue bonds, you'll drive up interest rates. Completely wrong. There's nothing in the experience of a household running its own budget that tells us anything about the fiscal constraints of a currency issuing government. A currency issuing government like Australia, like America, US, UK, can never run out of money. How's that? It issues a currency. How can it ever run out of something it issues? It's like saying the football game at the weekend has got to stop at the 46th minute because the scoreboard's run out of points. That's as stupid as saying that a government that issues its own currency can run out of it. Now, when I say it can not run out of it, doesn't mean that there shouldn't be constraints on spending. That's a different matter. But the government fiscal capacity is unlike the household budget. We can run out of money. If you don't believe me, here's Federal Bank of St. Louis, 2011. It's important to remember that government differs critical from businesses and individuals. As sole manufacturer of dollars, whose debt is denominated in dollars, the US government can never become insolvent, that is unable to pay its bills. In other words, can never run out of money. In intermediate macroeconomics, you have this boring period of your study where you learn about funding government spending and the different forms of funding, and you go into great detail about slopes of curves, and that tells you expansion and interest rate effects and all that. It's all nonsense. The claim is that bond issuing reduced the risk of deficits being inflationary, but printing money is highly inflationary. Well, think about what actually happens in the real world. When the government spends, it credits bank accounts. And so when it's spending, the deposits within the banking system increase. And the reserves in the banking system increase. Reserves are accounts held by commercial banks at the central bank for payments purposes, for clearing the payment system each day. If you think about any expenditure, whether it be export revenue, whether it be in private capital formation, whether it be household consumption or government spending, all spending carries an inflation risk, because all spending can drive nominal demand faster than the real capacity to respond in real output, and that will drive inflation. So government spending is not unique in that sense. But the monetary operation that's associated or not with the government spending is not the source of the inflation risk. It's the spending it's the impact in the product market that's the inflation risk. And you think about it, when the if the government decides to issue a bond, all it's really doing is provoking an asset swap within the portfolio of wealth of the person who buys the bond. They're swapping some deposit, some form of wealth saving somewhere for another form of paper. And the central bank is just typing in a number, reducing the reserves of the bank of the bondholder, and typing in a number in another account held there called bond. It's effectively what a bond sale is. an asset swap doesn't reduce the inflation risk at all. It's the spending that creates the inflation risk, not the monetary operation that's associated with it. Think about the other statement about printing money. Well, central banks don't print money. Mints print money. So again, it's important to use language properly, because printing money is an emotive term that invokes the Weimar Republic and more recently Zimbabwe. So central banks credit accounts, type in numbers. And we've got this elaborate story that if the government increases base money, that will be inflationary. Well, how does that work? Well, it works in the mainstream approach through the money multiplier. And it works through a belief in the quantity theory of money. And that causality can only be substantiated anyway if you're at full employment all the time. But I'll come back to the money multiplier. But think about the lessons of the last 8 years. You all understand how bank reserves have risen. Where's the inflation? How do you explain Japan? I'll come back to Japan at the end. So think about fiscal deficits and crowding out. The whole idea is a denial of the way in which the banking system operates. We had this idea that there's some finite savings and the government spending competes for those savings with other borrowers, and that through loanable funds type dynamics pushes up the interest rate, and that interest rate squeezes out the non-government spending. Well, if you talk to any banker who's senior enough to know what's going on, and what you learn is that bank lending isn't reserve constrained. The idea that the bank there's this finite amount of savings and reserves and the bank will lend them out to borrowers, and the competition for that squeezes up the yields. That's not how banking works. Bank lending is not reserve constrained in any way. The departments of the banks in the real world out there that make the loans don't hardly ever talk to the liquidity management departments on another floor. When banks make loans, they don't look up how many reserves the bank's got. They make them, and loans create deposits, and I'll come back to that. But if you think about what happens when there's a fiscal deficit, that actually creates downward pressure on the interest rates, the overnight interest rate. How does that work? Well, when there's a fiscal deficit, that's adding net financial assets to the non-government sector. Where do they, after all the transactions occur, where do those net financial assets actually end up in an accounting sense? In bank reserves. So deficits push up bank reserves. Now, bank reserves typically earn below the market interest rate. And in Japan, for example, zero. In the US, up until recently, zero. There's a disincentive for banks to hold excess reserves. Excess in terms of how much they need to ensure they can clear all their checks each day in the payment system. So what do the banks do if they've got what they perceive to be excess reserves on any particular day? They try to lend them out in the interbank market. They try to find a bank that might be short of reserves on any particular day. And of course that lending, that competitive process of trying to get rid of your excess reserves is futile, because each individual bank can't get rid of a system-wide excess. But in trying to get rid of their own excess, they start to drive the interbank rate down. And then there's a divergence. If the target policy rate that the central bank's running is above that rate, as the interbank rate falls, as the banks are trying to get rid of the excess reserves that have been created by the fiscal deficits, then the central bank's got two options. It can let the interbank rate drop to zero, which it will eventually do, or it can defend its policy rate by draining those excess reserves. And so it will sell bonds and swap the bonds for the excess reserves and give the commercial banks a competitive return. But the important point is that the dynamic of the deficit, without any other action occurring, is to drive interest rates down, not drive them up. And that issuing bond sales is then really an interest rate maintenance operation, not a funding operation, because the government doesn't need to be funded. It issues the currency. A couple more points. And again, think about what we teach students in terms of the money multiplier. There's this idea that the banks are sort of sitting there waiting for depositors to come in, and they come in, put the money in the bank, and then they lend it out again. And if the central bank pushes reserve, the central bank can control the growth of the money supply by pushing or extracting reserves from the system-based money. Well, banks don't lend out reserves. Loans create deposits. In other words, banks create the deposits out of thin air. They don't need to have reserves before they create the loans and the deposits. And the way of thinking about it is that the base money actually responds endogenously to the money supply growth, not the other way around. Because the central bank always has to, for financial stability purposes, stand ready to supply as many reserves that are needed to keep the payment system functional and the integrity of the system. And so the central bank is run. If you go in and find a friend in a central bank, ask them how they run their liquidity operations. They're continually monitoring the state of the bank reserves and making estimates of what the likely cross transactions between banks are, and they're continually running standing facilities to make sure that there's enough reserves. So if there's a heavy growth in money supply, it grows endogenously because of demands by borrowers. Loans create deposits, and then the reserves have to be consistent with that loan creation activity after the fact. Another very popular idea in recent period has been this idea of fiscal space. You've got all these estimates of who's got fiscal space and who hasn't. Well, it's all false non-knowledge. You can't define fiscal space of a currency issuing government. And you know I'm using the word currency issuing, and that excludes the 19 member states of the Eurozone, who use a foreign currency, effectively. Well, you can't define fiscal space of a currency issuing government in financial ratio terms. What does for a government that issues its own currency, what does a debt to GDP ratio of 20% mean compared to 80%? What does a fiscal deficit of 6% compared to 2% or a surplus of 1% mean in terms of the daily capacity of the currency issuing government to spend into the economy what it wants to fulfil its socio-economic mandate? It means nothing. And you've had all of this spreadsheet fiasco with rogue often characters trying to come up with thresholds where governments will go broke, and just non-knowledge. It's fake. And when you think about fiscal space, the only relevant concept can be that, first of all, the government can buy any real resource that's available for sale in its own currency. And I'm talking currency issuing governments here, including all idle labour. And so the fiscal space is defined by how many real resources are available for sale in that currency. That's fiscal space. You obviously can't buy more than is available. That's the only credible meaning of the concept of fiscal space. And fiscal sustainability then is that you buy as many idle resources and bring them back into productive use as there are. Here's the Bank of England. I should have gone to this. This is a really nice quote. Currently dominant intermediation of loanable funds model, the mainstream macro model, views banks as barter institutions that intermediate deposits of pre-existing real loanable funds between depositors and borrowers. The problem with this view is that in the real world there are no pre-existing funds. Loans create deposits. Funds come from nowhere. In the real world, there's no deposit multiplier mechanism that imposes quantitative constraints on banks' ability to create money. The main constraint is the bank's expectations concerning profitability and solvency. In other words, the credibility of the borrowers who are seeking to borrow money. The bank, therefore, creates its own funding, deposits, loans create deposits, in the act of lending. And because both entries are in the name of the customer X, there's no intermediation whatsoever at the moment when a new loan is made. No real resources need to be diverted from other uses by other agents in order to be able to lend to customer X. So why is it in our mainstream macroeconomics textbooks and in our classes, why is it that we teach them about crowding out? Why is it that we torture our students with excruciating discussions about slopes of IS and LM curves and shifts and all the rest of it, when in the real world it has no correspondence or meaning? My real world nonlinear macroeconometric model is Japan. And I started becoming very interested in Japan around the same time that I started visiting here in the early 90s. Because if you recall then, they had a property collapse, a commercial property collapse, like no other. It made the subprime collapse dwarf that. Property values collapsed completely. Japan never had a recession. And Japan expanded its fiscal deficit beyond belief. The central bank allowed bank reserves to expand dramatically and understood the way in which liquidity management worked. And so the interest rates, short-term interest rates, dropped to about zero. And they've held them there for decades. How do they do it? They leave just enough excess reserves in the money, in the cash market, in the cash economy, the cash system, so that the competition of the banks to get rid of their excess reserves, even though it's futile on a system-wide basis, keeps the short-term target rate at zero always. Yields on government bonds are now, well, they've turned positive again now, but the 10-year bond was negative a few weeks ago. Inflation hasn't been a problem for 20 years, 25 years, yet they've got the world's largest gross debt to GDP ratio and massive fiscal deficits. Well, if you tried to explain anything about Japan using mainstream macroeconomic models, you fail. It violates every prediction, every proposition that we teach our students. Now, I know what my colleagues say. They say, oh yeah, Japan's different. It's cultural issues and all of this stuff. Absolute nonsense. The operations of the Treasury, the operations of the central bank are virtually identical to the operations of the same institutions in every country. The language is just a bit different, and they have a different lunch. Virtually identical way of operating their monetary system. This point's the one that really bothers me. I think we've got to set up structures within our universities to allow academics to admit that this is a fake knowledge, and it allow us to, in a civilised way, to relearn how to do economics without pogroms, sort of like the South African Truth Commission. That's what we need. Because we've got to give people mainstream economists an exit strategy which doesn't attack them personally, to start relearning their trade. And the problem is that at the moment we mislead the public in a very dramatic fashion. We use language and concepts that lead the public to believe something that is totally untrue. And you extend that into sort of political philosophy and those type of issues, that compromises the workings of our democracies. We allow governments to, we support governments that have been advised by economists to lie. And I think a good place to start is to learn some modern monetary theory. Thanks very much.